I could not express the loveliness of those boys. They were different from all others present, and these latter did not appear to see them. There were besides Anne about 6 female relatives with their children and some men who accompanied them. Joachim guided the beast, upon which the child Mary sometimes rode. He carried a light, for it was still dark when they set out. A servant led the other. The little procession was also accompanied by the other apparitions of the prophets. As Mary hastened from the house, they pointed out to me a place in their rolls wherein it was declared that, although the temple was indeed magnificent, yet Mary contained in herself still greater magnificence. Mary wore the little yellowish gown and the large veil so fastened around her that her arms could rest in it. When she rode, the prophet boys followed behind her, but when she walked, they were at her side, singing the Psalm 44 and 49. I knew that the same would be sung at her reception in the temple. The child Mary saw those boys. The child Mary saw those boys, but she said nothing about it. She was perfectly silent, wholly recollected in self. The journey was difficult, over mountain and valley. In the latter lay chilling mists and dew. Once I saw the travelers resting at a fountain under some balsam trees, and again stopping overnight at an inn at the foot of a mountain. 12 leagues from Jerusalem. 12 leagues from Jerusalem, they came up at an inn with the herd that had been sent on in advance as an offering, and which was just about starting anew. Joachim was well known here and was quite at home. When taking his offerings up to Jerusalem, he had always stopped at this inn, and when from his penitential stay among the shepherds he returned to Nazareth, he had also put up here. I again saw the holy travelers in the city Bethoron, 6 leagues from Jerusalem. They had crossed a rivulet, had passed Gophna and Ozensara, and were still distant about 2 leagues from a road whence Jerusalem could be descried. At Bethoron they put up at a Levitical school. Relatives of Joachim and Anne from Nazareth, Sepphoris, Zabulon, and the country around had come hither with their daughters, and there was quite a little festival in Mary's honor. She was conducted with many other children to a hall in which a special place had been prepared for her on an elevated seat like a throne. She was then crowned. The teachers questioned her and were struck with all her answers. Mention was made of the wisdom of another maiden who not long since had returned from the temple to her home at Gophna. She was called Susanna, and I think that it was her place Mary was going to take in the temple. Susanna was then 15. Later she joined the holy women that followed Jesus. Mary rejoiced at being now so near to the temple. Joachim embraced her, weeping and saying, "I shall never see thee again." During the repast, Mary went here and there. Several times she reclined by Anne's side at table, or stood behind her with her arm around her neck. On the following day, accompanied by the teacher of the Levitical school and his family, they started very early for Jerusalem. The young girls carried beautiful fruits and garments as presents for the child. It looked to me as if there was going to be a real feast in Jerusalem. The nearer they approached the holy city, the more eager and desirous became Mary. She generally ran on before her parents. I saw the arrival of the procession in Jerusalem, and also beheld the roads and paths and buildings more distinctly than I had done for a long time. Jerusalem was a very singular-looking city. We must not represent it to ourselves, with its streets thronged as the great cities of the present day. Many steep and hilly streets ran around behind the city walls, from which no gates led. The houses lying high behind those walls faced the opposite side, for many parts of the city were built at subsequent periods, new ridges of hills being taken in accordingly. The old city walls, however, were always allowed to remain standing. Many of the deep valleys were spanned by massive stone arches. The courtyards and rooms of the houses all opened toward the back of the building, the entrance only being on the street. The walls were surmounted by terraces or balconies. The houses were kept closed the greater part of the time. When the inhabitants had no affairs to call them to the public places of the city or to the temple, they remained for the most part in their own houses and courts. It was tolerably quiet on the streets, excepting in the neighborhood of the markets and palaces, where there was much going on to and fro of soldiers and travelers. On certain days at the time when all were gathered in a temple for worship, the city in many localities was entirely deserted. On this account and the seclusion of the people in their houses, Jesus and his disciples were enabled to go undisturbed through the solitary streets and deep valleys. Water was not plentiful in the city. One often sees high buildings to and from which it was conveyed, also towers in which it was pumped. They were very careful of water at the temple, where such quantities were needed for washing and purifying the various vessels, etc. They had great engines for pumping it up. There were numbers of shopkeepers and merchants in the city. They had their booths altogether in the markets and open squares. So stood, for instance, not far from the sheep gate, many dealers in all kinds of gold trinkets and shining stones. Their booths were round and light and quite brown, as if streaked with something pitch or resin. Probably. Their booths were round and light and quite brown, as if streaked with something. Pitch or resin, probably. Though light, they were very strong. There they carried on their business, and, under the tents stretched from one to another, they exposed their different wares. There were also certain localities near the palaces, for instance, where there was more life in the streets, where it was more brisk. All Rome was indeed more pleasantly situated. It was not so steep, and its streets were more lively. On one side of the mountain upon which the temple was situated, the declivity was more gentle. Here there were several streets upon terraces, and on top of the thick walls, where some of the priests and servants of the temple dwelt, as did some laboring people who performed the lowest services, such as purifying the ditches wherein was thrown the offal of the cattle slaughtered for the temple. On the other side, the mountain was very steep, and the ditch quite black. Around the summit of the mountain was a green ledge whereon the priests had all kinds of little gardens. Even in Christ's time, there was upon certain parts of the temple work constantly going on. There were quantities of ore in the mountain upon which stood the temple, and much was dug out and used in the building. Inside the meadow were numbers of smelting vaults and furnaces. I never felt at home in the temple, for I never could find in it a place well suited for prayer. It was all so immensely solid, so massive, so high. The numerous courts were so narrow, dark, and obstructed by so many elevated platforms and seats that, when the people were in it, it presented a somewhat frightful spectacle, and even looked confined with its high massive walls and lofty pillars. The constant slaughtering going on and the quantities of blood flowing in consequence, I found most repulsive. Though words cannot express the wonderful order and cleanliness that reigned in everything connected with it. I saw the caravan that conducted Mary approaching Jerusalem from the north and winding toward the east around the outlying gardens and palaces of the city. They crossed the valley of Josaphat and, leaving the road to Bethania on the left, entered the city by the sheep gate leading to the cattle market. There was a pool here in which the sheep were washed. Thence their way turned to the right and ran below walls to another section of the city. Then they followed a long road through a valley and at last reached the neighborhood of the fish market at the west side of the city. Here stood the house at which Zachary, when engaged in the service of the temple, always put up. Out of this inn came men, women, and children with garlands to meet the caravan and to conduct them in ceremony to the house, about a quarter of an hour's distance, at which they were to stop. Zachary was not present, but I saw a very old man there, his father's brother, I think, and among those that came out to welcome Mary were relatives with their children from the country around Hebron and Bethlehem. There was a fine feast prepared for them in the house at which they stopped. The child Mary wore the second festival suit with the little blue mantle. Zachary called here for them, in order to take them to the feast inn that he had hired for them. This was an inn which could be hired on festival occasions like the present. There were 4 such inns on the northeast side of the mountain on which stood the temple. That hired by Zachary was very large. 4 halls surrounded a large court, along whose walls were sleeping places and long, low tables. A spacious saloon and a kitchen were also prepared for the guests. On 2 sides of this feast inn dwelt some of the servants of the temple, whose duty it was to see to the animals intended for sacrifice. The court wherein was placed the herd that Joachim had brought as an offering lay hard by. A procession was formed when Zachary was about to lead the travelers into the inn hired for the feast. He himself walked first with Joachim and Anne. Then came Mary, surrounded by 4 little girls in white and followed by the other children and relatives. Their way led to Herod's Blades and past that of the Roman governor, leaving the citadel of Antonia behind. At last they reached a high wall, up which there was a flight of more than 15 steps. Mary, to the astonishment of all, mounted them without assistance. Her friends wanted to help her, but she refused. Upon their entrance into the inn, their feet were washed. Then they were shown into a large hall, in the center of which a lamp was suspended from the ceiling over a large metal basin of water. Here they washed their face and hands. Joachim and Anne then went up with Mary to the dwelling of some of the priests. Here, likewise, urged by an interior spirit, the child hurried to mount the steps. The 2 priests cordially received them into the house. Both had been present at Mary's examination in Nazareth. They called one of the women belonging to the temple, where she executed all kinds of works common to females, and educated little girls. Her abode was at some distance from the temple, among the added rooms forming the sleeping apartments of the temple virgins. Out of these rooms one could, unseen, look down into the sanctuary. The widow was so enveloped in her mantle that one could see only a little of her face. The priests and the parents delivered the child Mary over to her as her future pupil. She received her gravely but cordially, while the child was all submission and reverence. She, the widow, accompanied the party to the feast inn and received a package as the child's dowry. The following day was taken up with preparations for Joachim's sacrifice and for Mary's entrance into the temple. Joachim went early with his offering of cattle to the temple, in front of which the animals for the sacrifice were selected. Those not chosen were at once led back to the cattle market. Joachim had to lay his hand upon the head of each animal before it was slaughtered, and he afterward received some of the flesh and blood of each. There were in this place many pillars, tables, and vessels, where the sacrifices were cut up, divided, and arranged. The scum of the blood was put aside, the fat, the spleen, and the liver separated, and all parts were salted. The entrails of the lambs were cleaned, filled with something, and again restored to the animal so that it looked like a whole lamb. The feet were bound crosswise. A great portion of the meat was taken to a court in which were some of the temple virgins. They seemed to have something to do connected with it. Perhaps they had to prepare it either for themselves or for the priests. All was carried on with indescribable order. The priests and Levites came and went 2 and 2, and during the difficult and multifarious work, all progressed as if by line and level. The pieces prepared for sacrifice lay over till the next day. In the inn was held a feast, and there was also a repast, at which about 100 people assisted along with the children. among them 24 girls of different ages. Among others I saw Seraphia, who was called Veronica after the death of Jesus. She was already well grown, probably from 10 to 12 years old. They prepared garlands and wreaths for Mary and her companions, and ornamented for them 7 scepter-shaped lamps on whose summit burned a flame. During the feast, many priests and Levites went in and out of the inn, taking part also in the repast. When they expressed surprise at the greatness of Joachim's offering, he bade them recall the ignominy he had endured at the temple when his former offerings were rejected, and the great mercy of God who had heard his supplications, and he asked them whether he should not now express his gratitude according to the extent of his power. I saw the child, Mary, and the other girls taking a walk in the neighborhood of the house. Zachary and the other men had already gone to the temple, and now Mary was led thither by the women and the virgins. Anne and her elder daughter Mary Healy, when with the little daughter of the latter, Mary Cleophas, walked first. Then came Mary in her second suit, the sky-blue dress and mantle, her neck and arms adorned with garlands, and the flower-wreathed candlestick in her hand. On either side walked 3 little maidens with similarly trimmed candlesticks. They were dressed in white embroidered with gold, and wore bluish mantles. They were quite covered with garlands, even their arms were twined with flowers. Then followed the other virgins and little girls, about 20 in number, all dressed beautifully, but somewhat differently, though all wore mantles. Then came the elderly females. They could not proceed straight to the temple from this point. They had to take a circuitous route of nearly half an hour. They passed through some streets and before Veronica's house. From many of the dwellings the procession was saluted, the spectators gazing in wonder at the child and her beautiful train of attendants. There was something very extraordinary in Mary's appearance. At the temple, men were busy opening a large and wonderfully beautiful gate upon which were carved grapevines, ears of wheat, and heads of various kinds. It was the Golden Gate. The priests led the Holy Virgin up numerous steps to this gate. Joachim and Zachary met them at the gate, which opened into a long archway and led them through several passages into a hall. Here Mary was again questioned by the priests, after which she was clothed in the 3rd holiday suit, the violet blue embroidered one. And now Joachim went with the priests to offer sacrifice. He took fire from a certain place and stood between 2 priests at the altar. The approach to the altar from 3 sides was free, but not so on the 4th. At the 4 corners of the altar stood small copper pillars and a pipe of the same metal, shaped like a large inverted funnel, which ended in a spiral tube. By this arrangement, the smoke from the burning sacrifice rose and escaped over the head of the priest. On 3 sides of the altar, a shelf could be drawn out to receive what was to be laid on the middle of it, since to reach that far would be impossible. When the sacrifice was kindled, Mary went with the women and children to her place of prayer in the women's porch, where she and her young companions stood in the front row. The porch was separated from the court of the altar of burnt offerings by a wall, in which was a gate with a grating above. Through this gate Joachim entered the subterranean passage, when, upon the day of Mary's Immaculate Conception, he met Anne under the Golden Gate. The women back in the court could see the altar better when mounted on steps raised in tiers. In another court was standing a crowd of white-robed boys belonging to the temple, playing upon flutes and harps. After the sacrifice, a portable altar was set up under the arched gateway, and before it were placed a couple of steps. Zachary and Joachim, with some priests and 2 Levites, entered from the court of the altar of burnt offerings, carrying rolls and writing materials, while Anne led Mary to the steps before the altar. Mary knelt upon the steps, while Joachim and Anne, laying their hands on her head, uttered some words bearing reference to the offering of their child, which words were written down by the 2 Levites. Then one of the priests cut a lock of hair from the child's head and cast it upon a pan of live coals, after which he threw around her a brown veil. During this ceremony the girls sang Psalm 44, Eructavit cor meum, The priest's Psalm 49, Deus Deorum Dominus, and the boys played on their musical instruments. And now the priests led the Holy Virgin up a long flight of steps in the wall that separated the sanctuary from the rest of the temple. They stood her in something like a niche from which she could see into the temple where were arranged numbers of men who seemed to be consecrated to its service. 2 priests stood at Mary's side and several others on the steps praying and reading aloud from rolls. Behind Mary and on the other side of the wall, a priest was standing at the altar of incense, only half of his person visible from the point at which Mary and her attendants were placed. Through an opening contrived for the purpose, one could cast incense upon the altar without entering the court. The priest now at the incense altar was a holy old man. While he offered sacrifice in the cloud of incense, arose around Mary, I saw a vision which grew in magnitude until at last it filled the whole temple and obscured it. I saw above the heart of Mary the glory and the mystery of the Ark of the Covenant. At first it looked exactly like the Ark of the Covenant, and lastly like the temple itself. Out of the mystery and before Mary's breast arose a chalice similar to that of the Last Supper. Above it, and just in front of her mouth, it appeared bread marked with a cross. Beams of light radiated around her, and in them shone her various types and symbols. The mysterious pictures of the Litany of Loreto and the other names and titles of Mary I saw ranged up the whole flight of steps and around her. Beams of light radiated around her, and in them shone her various types and symbols. The mysterious pictures of the Litany of Loreto and the other names and titles of Mary I saw ranged up the whole flight of steps and around her. From her shoulders, right and left, stretched an olive and a cedar branch, crosswise above an elegant palm tree, with a small tuft of leaves that stood directly behind her. In the intervening spaces of this verdant cross appeared all the instruments of Christ's passion. Over the vision hovered the Holy Spirit, a figure winged with glory, in appearance more human than dove-like. The heavens opened above Mary, and the central point of the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God, floated over her with all the gardens, the palaces, and the dwellings of the future saints. Angels in myriads hovered around, and the glory that encircled her was full of angelic faces.